Well, I think every deal affects every other deal, right? It always has. There is always a precedential effect, one way or the other. And Mike, you know this. I mean, you're always talking about as a negotiator, you're always talking about the previous contracts and trying that work in your favor and trying to avoid discussing the ones that don't. Right? It's just the truth that's old as time, and so I think the Dax situation can't help but impact both Buffalo and Baltimore. I think if anything, the lesson learned is there's really it's difficult to wait. It gets more expensive to wait, but you also I don't think you can also ignore the fact that there can be value in waiting. We were talking about this a while back, how the franchise tag doesn't seem to scare players like it used to. It certainly does, nor should it, right? And the idea of whether it's Kirk Cousins or whether it's Dak last year on the 1 year deals, those can work out for the players, but they can also work out for the team. And I don't think that's I don't think you can ignore that fact when you've got a situation where there may be some question marks. And I think maybe more instructive than the Dax contract are what's happened with Wentz, and what's happened with Goff, and looking at those extensions and what the teams had to do to try and move on from those guys just a short time later. And that's where I think if anything, the dynamics of the approach might change a little bit from a team's perspective, because now the pendulum could swing back to say, if we're not sure about where these guys are in their development, and I'm not saying that about either Allen or Jackson, but if there are questions, the idea of waiting a year after a franchise tag is not unpalatable at all if you can maintain a good relationship with the player. But all that being said, I would still endeavor to go get something done now as soon as you could, even if you end up overpaying a little bit. You lock those guys in for the long haul, and you start building your cap around them, and the more predictability you have in that centerpiece of your franchise, the better off you're going to be. But again, you got to be confident that guy is the centerpiece, because once you're locked in, and to get out of it is going to cost you, just like the Rams and the Eagles will attest to.
Tom, what's interesting is, like, it happened to me in my career. I'm like, we'll never see this again in our lifetime. It happened with Wentz, which is, Mark Sanchez, we draft him, we go to 2 championship games, we give him this massive extension, and then he plays worse. And like Carson Wentz is really the same fact pattern. Carson Wentz, they trade up for, they hit on him. Our speculation was very few starts for Mark at SC. Philadelphia's projection was, competition, North Dakota. And, for me, like, if you look at Wentz's career, the fact that, to me, this was about confidence, you would say that would be early in his career with a transition from North Dakota to the NFL. And to me, it's a very much of a cautionary tale of, here's 2 different situations where guys got significant extensions to try to save money proactively, and it didn't work out. But with that said, here's the tricky one for me is, I think you look at Josh Allen, like, he had a major injury at Wyoming with his shoulder. He's a contact player. There is a real, he's a big man. There's a lot to hit. And I don't know, I don't think you can't not extend him, because he's playing great. He's young. He's high character. He's, he checks every box. But if we were running a car insurance company and we, from an actuarial standpoint, just looked at the facts, it's not unreasonable to think that he's going to have something at some point.
There's no question. And this, you see the same thing with Lamar too. I mean, and they've taken steps to protect him out there in their system to do that, to keep him from being on the run quite as much anymore. And they're going to have to continue to sort of change that ratio as the career progresses. But that's going to be the overriding concern and it started with Mahomes, but it'll keep going forward on all the new breed of quarterbacks. The more athletic, mobile guys are the ones that are at greater risk. You can't put, for Mark, you can't slap a Dan Marino knee brace on him and keep him propped up in the pocket for a number of years, right? So that doesn't work anymore. But you can protect them within the system a little bit better. And I think guys like that tend to get smarter over time too. They know how to protect their bodies. They know how to, begin to learn how to take a hit or not take a hit, as the case may be. And you're right. You also know we don't deal with actuary tables. You have to take the best available information and then place a bet on it. And as well as I do, how hard it is to find those guys. And I still am, I still am dumbfounded at your stat on the 5 trade ups in the first round and what those 5 quarterbacks are. So even when you think you found one, you might not have. And that's
and Tom, just keep in mind that was top 3. Those right. There was in 10 years, there was 5 trades into the top 3, and it was 0 for 3. It was 0 for 5.
Well, and there's dozens of them underneath the top 3, right? You think of all the ones
right.
You can go chapter and verse on all those guys and all the misses that happen throughout the first round on those. So when you have one, you do end up with some confirmation bias because you want to have every data point support the fact that he is your guy, right? That's your desire because you don't want to have to go find another one. But I'll tell you something we did with Stafford in 2013. We went through this very thing. Because we thought Stafford had the chance to be a really special guy. We knew his arm talent. We obviously, we drafted him and we played with him and in 2011 he had a great year. In 2012 he had the entire franchise had a down year, so we went from playoffs to 4-12 the following year. His interceptions jumped up, his touchdowns got cut in half, and we were sitting there saying, it's time to do a deal on this guy. We had, as you remember, it was the last of the bad rookie contracts before the wage scale came in 2011. But so we really needed to do something with him. And I was able to sit down with him and say, look, here's an idea. We can do a short-term extension. We did a 3-year deal. Condon hated the idea, did not want to do it, wanted to maximize the signing bonus, push out the pro rate, the typical structure. And what we were able to do is convince Matt that he was betting on himself and that it was very, very rare for a quarterback to get a third bite at the apple in the prime of his career at 29 years old. And really for a quarterback, that would set him up for a 4th bite at the apple while he's still in the quarterback prime, which again is almost unheard of. And when we laid that out for him and looked at it as a potential for both sides to place a little bit of bet on themselves, he actually gravitated towards that. And in his case, it worked out well. And I think you could argue with the trade the Lions made, it worked out well for them in the end too, even after they extended him in 2017. So that's the definite harder road to travel. But I think if you could do that, with it to go back to the Josh Allen example, if you could figure out a way to do that, that gives you 3 years of his athletic best where he's running around, and it gives you a little bit of a hedge against that injury risk that we were just talking about.
One other thing I wanted to hit on, do you think generally speaking, because I feel this way, like teams are valuing 1st-round picks differently than they were 5 years ago? Like, it used to be like you would trade up for a 1, like go back to that Kansas City Buffalo trade. Kansas City, I forgot where they were drafting that year, but they traded up to 10 to get Mahomes, and it was for a future 1. Now it's like that kind of gets thrown out the window, and whatever it takes to get the quarterback, it's like a blank check almost.
Yeah, you're right. You and I were both raised when 1st-round picks were like 500-pound manhole covers. You just didn't throw them around, right? I mean, you just didn't. And now they're they're frisbees. And you're right. I mean, and I mentioned the NBA a little while back, and I think that's what's really happening here is there's an evolution toward as we become more analytical. And I think there's great value to the increasing amount of analytics. But what that does is turn your 1st-round pick as this nameless, faceless sign of hope where you can get that difference-making Pro Bowl player to something on much more akin to what you were saying earlier on the actuarial table. You realize that the probability of landing that Pro Bowl player when you look at it analytically is microscopic compared to what else could happen, right? Especially if you're sitting in the middle late part of the 1st round. So, or you think you're going to be sitting in the middle of the late part of the first round in future years, it gets a lot easier to think of those as assets with a wide range of application, as opposed to an asset that only could translate into, a Pro Bowl player, a sort of mediocre role player, or a bust.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, it's definitely more. It's not a one size fits all approach anymore. Like
Right.
I think that's right, Tom. Like it used to be, there was like you said, like the sanctity of like, hey, this is a first round pick. And it's like you held on to that for like dear life. And
Yeah. But now if I say, wait a minute, my 2023 first round pick, so I have to discount that 2 years forward, right? Then I really factor in it's a 50-50 shot. Well, what did Bill Polian used to say? If you bat over 500, you're as a GM in the first round, you're a Hall of Famer. And
right.
that's so call it a 50-50 proposition, and then discounted 2 years back. You all of a sudden start to say, well, that's not, the value of that thing isn't as great as what I project it might be in my mind when I could get that elusive need player who's going to end up developing into a Pro Bowler that I'm going to fall in love with 2 years from now.
Tommy, it was interesting, like being in the media now. There's two things I think, generally speaking, the media like totally overvalues. One is first round picks, and two is cap room. Like
Yeah.
they almost become like these prepositional phrases, like, "Hey, the Jacksonville Jaguars with 8, whatever," or like, show me the high character, durable, young, productive players that really change and create. It just doesn't happen, and it's like you can make targeted improvements, but we make so much more of it in the media. Like they have all these draft choices. The point being is like the 2023 49er first round pick, if it's a top 5 pick, yeah, great move.
Right.
But it could also be, 30. And
yeah, Houston didn't trade their first rounder thinking it was going to be in the top 5 this year, right? I mean,
right.
You never do. It never works out that way. And there's no doubt that with more of the first round picks moving now, you're going to have more of those circumstances arise, right? Where you're not the unpredictability of the future, and all of a sudden you're going to say, in hindsight, would I made it? Absolutely not. But if you're in the AFC Championship game, and now all of a sudden you're drafting at 31, yeah, or 28, of course you'd make that trade. But we obviously don't have the benefit of that hindsight view. So you go into it knowing, again, going back to the sort of the math and the analytical sense, that what is the real value, projected value of that player I'm going to get, regardless of whether I'm taking it, and right, you probably bracket that in the middle, right? It's your predictability for a 2023 draft choice. You're going to be somewhere between 10 and 22, right? You're not going to bet that it's going to be in the top 10, almost like a lottery protected pick, and you're not going to bet that you're deep into the playoffs and you're going to be at the bottom. You're going to bet it that it's going to be somewhere in the middle, and that's the value you're going to ascribe to it when you're trying to value the trade you're making today. That's always a dangerous game to play, because you start to, and the answer is always going to be, you always come up with the answer that you want, right, based on the player you compare it to in his contract. Right. So that gets into it. To me, it's an exercise in futility. I mean, you're clearly not going to say, beauty's in the eye of the beholder. How much less valuable is Ryan Fitzpatrick than Dak Prescott? We can play that game all day long. And at what point do you pay Ryan Fitzpatrick enough for that to be in balance, or how much of a pay cut does Dak have to take for it to get in balance? Doesn't really matter, because neither one of those things is going to happen. The reality is that the way I would look at it from a team standpoint is, how many of your cap dollars do you have tied up in that core on your offense, and how much flexibility you have to add to that offense when some of those pieces aren't working out, or you feel like you need to add pieces around them, or you got to take care of the other side of the ball and make sure you've got the ability over there. And that's why I like where Washington's sitting right now, because they've got a really strong front 4. They got, I would argue, probably a front 7, but they got obviously a strong, incredibly strong young front on the defensive side. And with what they've got on the offensive side right now and the weapons around Fitzpatrick, I thought what they did in free agency was very shrewd. It was strategic. It was very consistent with, I obviously worked with Martin for a long time, very consistent, know the way he thinks about free agency. And I think it's consistent with the way Marty and Ron think that way. Being able to add a couple of pieces. They got the corner I think upgraded probably at the corner spot, added, to help the defense out. They were able to get a guy like Fitzpatrick, who they can feel confident in the ability to shepherd the offense while they're figuring out the quarterback situation. It's a little like we were talking about earlier as it relates to the 49ers. It's just that Garoppolo's in a different situation than Fitzpatrick, contractually and otherwise. So it could be a little bit more of an uncomfortable quarterback room in San Francisco if that develops than it would be in Washington with Fitzpatrick, since obviously he's been in half the quarterback rooms in the league in those kinds of situations and is accustomed to it. But I really like how they've set themselves up, because unlike the Cowboys, they now have the flexibility to build the nucleus as it develops, where the Cowboys nucleus is locked in right now. And if something happens to one of those guys, it presents a really tough circumstance for them. And that the probability of that happening, I think, is increased when one of those core guys is a running back, especially one that runs like Zeke does. I mean, talk about it. We were just talking about in the context of Josh Allen, the quarterback position. Zeke obviously takes a ton of punishment at the running back position. And whether you can point to any number of running backs who have gotten paid and then gotten beat up shortly after they got paid, and it creates a problem for the team. And when you've got a guy that you valued as highly as the Cowboys have valued Deke, and you run into a challenge there, that does become a drag going forward, right at the time that Washington's being able to capitalize on the flexibility they have to customize their nucleus as they see fit moving into 2022 and beyond.
I still think if you go back 2 years ago, they paid Zeke. They didn't need to do that.
Agreed.
And Tom, look, between us, we've done 8 gazillion deals. I still think there's a way to get him and Todd France in a room and say, hey, we're not leaving without doing a deal. And you know what, Dak, you can bet on yourself. With that said, and it's exactly what you talked about with Stafford a minute ago. We want to do a 6-year deal. You want to go 1 year. We're going to split the difference. And Dak, we want to give you security, but here's why this is going to help us build a better team.
Exactly.
Like, I think there was a way, and I think, for as successful as Jerry's been, I don't think they do a great job of strategic planning there.
No, and they haven't done a great job of strategic planning there since the reason there's a Dion rule, right? Going back into the late 90s and early 2000s when they had a different nucleus, but it was, it was a Hall of Fame nucleus, and they were adding Hall of Fame pieces like Dion to the mix. That's never been Jerry's mindset. I don't think is long-term strategic planning. It's been short-term talent acquisition and trying to fit the pieces together, and with a pretty much a damn the torpedoes approach to the future. Who cares? We'll deal with the future when it's here. I think that mitigated a little bit in 2010, 2011, when they were smarting a little bit from some of their maneuverings prior to that. And Steven, I think, got everything calmed down for a while, and Jerry would cop to that, right? But I think that's changed a little bit now, when they felt like they had the second coming of the trio together, and they started to kind of rebuild the same trio from the late 90s. And I agree with you. I don't think they needed to go do that with Dak, do that with Elliott as when they did. There's just no reason to go do and extend the running back. And I also completely agree with you that the one position that's out there that you can afford to sit down and talk with that person is your quarterback. If you feel like he's your guy, you have to sit down and really go through the cap with him, go through what your long-term strategic planning is, not in detail, but make the quarterback a part of the team, not just on the field or downstairs in the locker room, but upstairs in the front office too. And I do think, I disagree with those. I know there are a lot of folks who say you got to keep the two separate. I think there's a role for the quarterback to play in at least in the line of communication about where you're taking the franchise.